Okay, so our last text is probably the most difficult. There's a couple, oh, their name just escaped me. Peg and, oh, he writes prolifically.
We're not moving forward until we get this.
When I say it, you'll know. So there's this couple. He writes lots of books, and she speaks with him, and he takes the pro side, and she takes the negative side.
I got it. Tony Campolo.
See?
Yeah.
Tony and Peg Campolo.
Yeah.
And really, their back and forth comes down to this text. And
yeah,
right. he would even say, he's on this side, he would say, this is the most difficult text. So if you kind of can understand this one, the other ones I think you can, you know, the differences are pretty clear. This one's a little muddy. So let's read the text first.
And that's why we saved it for last. I mean, it's out of order in terms of scripture.
Yeah.
But, sorry.
So, that's okay. So, verses 24 through 32. Therefore, God gave them up, and you'll see who them is, in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the degrading of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men, and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind and to things that should not be done. They were filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, covetousness, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, craftiness. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, rebellious toward parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. They know God's decree that those who practice such things deserve to die. Yet they not only do them, but even applaud others who practice them. Whew. I'm glad I don't do any of those things. So I think what you probably know, if you've read any of Romans, is that Paul is a very logical person. He makes this very logical argument about things, and it's a legal argument based on the justice system. He says, Jesus came to fulfill the law. And not just to fulfill the law, but to affirm the Old Testament law. So the Old Testament isn't, done and over with. It's a continuation. Jesus came to continue what was there. He fulfilled it and brings it into the future. So what was bad then is bad now. What's good then is good now. And that clearly describes homosexuality. Homosexuality was part of the moral law in the Old Testament that was condemned as sin. Jesus came to affirm that law, to build on that law, and so homosexuality today is a sin. Another example to make this point, Jesus said, not just those who commit adultery are guilty of the sin in the Ten Commandments of committing adultery, but those who have lust in their hearts. Right? So he was building on the law. He was expanding law. He was growing the law. He was saying, you can't just go by the letter of the law, right? Jesus even said this. It's the spirit of the law that's important. And so let's not throw out these old laws, the traditionalist would say, but let's keep the law and build on them and understand what we need to understand about those things today. So there's one other argument that I think supports this position, and that's the argument about genetics. So, you know, some people say that biology determines whether you're a homosexual or not. So, biology can also determine whether you're an alcoholic or not, right? It can also determine whether you have some horrible diseases. And I don't know what all of them are, but things like MS and some of these horribly debilitating, Lou Gehrig's and debilitating diseases are genetically programmed into our bodies. We don't say about those things, well, let's just let people be alcoholics then. Let's just let people have Lou Gehrig's and get MS and all those sorts of things. No, we say no. Those are bad things. Those are things we don't want people to have. So we become aware of them. We create science that helps to change them. It's important to understand that this is not natural. This is unnatural. And so it's against God's law.
Wow. That's pretty convincing. Genetics can determine sexual orientation, and genetics can determine alcoholism. Genetics also determine that my eyes are brown and that my dominant hand is right. The difference between arguing that even if sexual orientation is determined by genetics, that doesn't give one a right to practice it, as we would say to one who's an alcoholic, you shouldn't practice it even if you're genetically determined to it. Where that argument fails is that living out one's genetical orientation does no harm to anyone, whereas living out one's alcoholism does. I'll start by saying that. Now I'd like to go on in this very important passage in Romans 1 to sort of unpack, I think, a very clear way Paul's logic. And Jody presented the opposing view and talked often about Paul's logic. I think this all hinges on two words. 3 times the word natural or unnatural appear in verse 26 and 27. And unless we understand natural and unnatural, we're going to misunderstand Paul's argument and Paul's limitations. A brief summary of that is in the background statement. I'm not going to read that now, but I'm going to expand that right now. If we were to read the entire first chapter of Romans, we would see Paul's logic unfold. Paul is making an argument that follows a very precise logical path. Paul is saying that all people start with a knowledge of God, okay? Especially the knowledge that comes through the created world around us. We all start with some knowledge. We look outside, we see a blue sky, and whether we name it God or whether we can define it as God formed, we are aware of some power, some higher power, some force behind the universe that makes buds come from dead-like tree branches, that turns brown sod into green grass. We are aware of some creative energy in the world that Paul would call God. We have that knowledge, says Paul. All people have that knowledge. We have it from the day we're born, and it develops in us, and this awareness, whether we can articulate it or not, is there. There's a knowledge for that. And then Paul goes on to say, after making that claim, we all have this knowledge of God, our Creator, but some people exchange this knowledge of God for worship of false gods. We took this knowledge of a benevolent, diverse Creator, and we exchanged it for a god of stone, or we carved it into a bar of soap, and we put it on the mantelpiece, and we pay homage to it, and we slit our wrists, and we do all kinds of worship of this god that we put on the mantelpiece, and we might even offer our children to this God who delights in the sacrifice of our children. Paul's saying some people exchange this wonderful knowledge of a deity, of a Creator, of a God, for a God of paganism. All right? There's an exchange that happened. Paul takes this same knowledge and applies it to sexuality. He said, and by the way, this is the first time women are introduced to this topic of homosexuality. It comes here in verse 26. He says, women exchange natural intercourse for unnatural. Paul is saying, women were created for one type of intercourse. Logically, we would say, this is Paul's thinking. Women were created to have intercourse with men, but they exchanged that knowledge and exchanged it to have sexual relationships with women. Likewise, he said in the same way, men were created by this great Creator for intercourse with women, but men exchanged that sexuality, consciously exchanged it to have relationships with other men, Paul is saying. There's an exchange that happened. Paul is saying you weren't created that way, but you made a conscious decision and a behavioral change to same-gender relationships. So Paul's logic is this. Both men and women and all men start with an innate, a natural heterosexuality. That's their natural, created, God-given identity. Paul says every man was created to be with another woman. Every woman was created to be with another man. That's natural, says Paul. The sin comes in, says Paul, when people have made that conscious decision to exchange that sexuality for that which is unnatural, for men to be with men and women to be with men, and for women to be with women. They choose to go against what is natural for them. Here's the problem. Nobody in Paul's day, nobody for centuries after Paul understood anything about homosexual orientation. Nobody in Paul's day, or for centuries afterward, understood anything about DNA, about genetics, about what the Creator puts in us, how our bodies function, who we really are, who we are born to be. Paul didn't understand that. You know, all Paul saw was people who were exchanging what seemed to be natural, men with women and women with men, exchanging it for men to be with men and women to be with women. He said, that's not natural, he said, and you shouldn't do it. And he lists that among all the other sins that were read for us. They're the same as gossipers and slanderers and God-haters and insolents and haughty and boastful, etc., etc., etc. I think here's what we have to understand about Paul and his world. They didn't have the knowledge that we do. They just simply did not. You know, when we read the Bible, we're reading about a people who understood that the world was flat. Why, you know, in the Bible, why do we have the four corners of the earth? Because the world is flat. Why is there a hell beneath the earth and a heaven above the earth? Because it's a three-tiered universe. There's a reason why cartographers up to the 14th, 15th century, well, 13th century at least, whenever they created a map of the world, there were always dragons on the edges of the map, because if you went that far on a ship, you were bound to be attacked by dragons before you dropped off the edge of the world, right? And I don't think we have to excuse Paul. That's all Paul had to work with in terms of what's natural and what's unnatural. I would add to Paul this, and if Paul were here, I had no doubt that Paul would add this to Romans chapter 1 and perhaps even create another epistle or letter for people to read. I believe Paul would say homosexuals are not exchanging one thing for another. They are doing what the Creator created them to do and being who the Creator created them to be. They are not exchanging what they were born to think and feel for something else. They are only coming to that awareness. For most, very early in life, before they even could make a decision about it, they came to that awareness. If somebody asked me, when did you decide to be heterosexual? I couldn't say, gee, I never decided that. I came to an awareness about it. And same is true for homosexuals. Gay men, gay women are being faithful to living out their attraction for same-gender partners because, as Paul would say, if Paul had known what we know now today, they are doing what is natural for them, and that brings honor to the Creator. If Paul were alive today, I think Paul would say to heterosexuals and to homosexuals, be who you were created to be. Be your natural God-given self. Live as sexual beings in committed, loving relationships, respecting your partners. Be who you are, and in your living, may God be praised.